And there are many things in the Old Testament that are profoundly non-ideal, right? And then Jesus says, and I have come to restore things to the intention at the beginning. So there's lots we could go into there, but I think it's very important to read Scripture as a story with a shape to it. In the beginning, goodness, a fall into something that's very suboptimal. And even Jesus says, look, Moses gave you even laws that was suboptimal.
Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. So you just heard that a Christian apologist admitting that the Old Testament contains things that are profoundly non-ideal and that Moses gave suboptimal laws. Today I stumbled across this debate between Glenn Scrivener, a Christian minister and author, and Joe, an agnostic philosopher, arguing over whether morality can exist without God. And this debate takes a turn when a student in the audience hits Glenn with a philosophical trap that is over 2,000 years old. And Glenn admits on camera that he knows it is a trap before he even tries to answer. So make sure you watch until the end because it only gets more intense from there. Please comment down below where you are watching from. I really love to see people from all over the world connecting in here. All right, now let us get into the video.
Not particularly. Actually. I think that there again. I think this touches on that linear causation versus sort of grand distinction that I've sort of been pulling upon a couple of times in the discussion. I think you're probably right in the sense. Like I said, I think that it doesn't strike me as particularly problematic that we would eventually get kind of a causal story of how human evolution, coupled with things like potentially group selection and things, this idea that you can, the human, the tools that eventually that made us empathize and find our own children cute can be expanded outwards, and then also the kind of development of culture and stuff. I think that the causal story of how we got to our current moral system is fine. I think that there, or certain philosophers, I think, definitely would raise potential worries about transforming the simple description of Darwinism as a means to causally explain why we have certain moral intuitions, like adultery is wrong or something like that. I think that a lot of people would have an issue with then the further inference that means that those rules should, or those intuitions are true or should continue to be upheld. It's not that I think that Darwinism is incompatible with a story. Obviously, I don't think it's incompatible with a story that will make those, that will ground those in something moral realist or moral realist adjacent. I just think there will have to be a story on top of that. Yeah, I think that's just the kind of Isolde gap, I suppose.
When you say this, sorry, when you say the story, no, it's okay. When you say the story on top of that, do you mean some kind of explanation as to how this direction of goodness comes about? Is that what you're saying? What do you mean by this?
Sorry, I mean kind of a truth maker for statements like murder is wrong. When I ask you, okay, why is that? How do you know that table has got a white cloth on it or something like that? What, in virtue of what is that statement true? You can point to it and you can say, okay, it's true because of this stuff, because of certain facts about sense perception. You can touch it. That's kind of. But that's not necessarily a linear causal story. It's a story about how that fact is grounded upon other facts. What makes that true? And I think,
Yeah, so you're taking a step back, going, how is this all here in the first place?
Well, not so much like how is it all here, but in virtue of what is a given statement true or false. If that makes sense. I don't know if that's. I don't know if I'm expressing myself particularly.
Thank you, Hardened.
I think there was a guy in behind you. The question first.
I'm curious. If God is the source of morality, what attribute of God would you say makes God the definite an objective source of morality rather than a perspective of morality? I guess could you believe in a creator God or even a Christian God and disagree with them on a moral issue?
You're setting me up for the trap the Jews set earlier, aren't you? I see much into it. No, that's no, very good question. Because I think Joe was sort of anonymously raising Euthyphro. We kind of.
I didn't want to call it you. I don't think I didn't want to draw on the arbitrary of these passages. I just want to draw on the definition of love.
Yes. Euthyphro, people who understand. Yes. You study Euthyphro? Yeah, okay. So, is the pious loved by the gods because it is pious? Or is it called pious because the gods love it? Is there some virtue that stands above God that makes him moral? Or is it just that God says it must be good? Which sounds pretty arbitrary at that point. So the Euthyphro dilemma kind of comes up in Socrates' last dialogue, Plato's last dialogue. And in a sense, Plato's got a solution to his own dilemma in that there is the Platonic realm of the good, which is, as you say, kind of non-conscious, impersonal. And so Plato's answer to that question is, well, whatever we say is God is just the good. It's just an equivalency. And that has a certain... that sort of solves the dilemma, but it doesn't sound very satisfying. It doesn't sound very satisfying to me as a Christian, because if goodness is grounded in something that is impersonal, that feels unfitting to me, that the highest good is itself incapable of goodness.
This is the moment that philosophy students have been waiting for in this entire debate. Because what you just witnessed is not just a question, it is a trap. And the beautiful thing is, Glenn knows it is a trap. He literally admits it out loud. Let me break down why this matters so much. The student asks what might sound like a simple question. What attribute of God makes him the objective source of morality? But that question is actually one of the oldest and most devastating challenges to religious morality in the history of Western philosophy. We're talking about the Euthyphro dilemma, first posed by Plato over 2,000 years ago. And here is what makes this so fascinating. Glenn immediately recognizes the problem. He says out loud that the student is setting him up. That right there tells you everything. When someone admits they are walking into a trap before they even attempt to answer, that is not confidence, that is damage control. Now pay attention to how Glenn frames the dilemma himself. He asks whether something is good because the gods love it, or whether the gods love it because it is already good. This is exactly the problem that theists have struggled with for literally thousands of years, and there is no clean escape. Here is why this dilemma is so powerful. If you say that something is good only because God says so, then morality becomes completely arbitrary. It means that if God decided tomorrow that cruelty was good, then cruelty would be good. There would be no independent standard. That is terrifying if you think about it. But if you go the other direction and say that God commands things because they are already good, then you have just admitted that goodness exists independently of God, which means you do not actually need God to have morality. The standard exists on its own. And you have to understand what Joe set up earlier in this segment. He made the point that any moral system, including ones based on God, eventually has to just declare something is good without further justification. You cannot escape that problem by invoking God. You just push the question back one step. What I love about this exchange is that a student asked this question. This is not some professional philosopher trying to embarrass Glenn. This is someone genuinely curious. And that curiosity exposed the foundational crack in the argument that you need God for objective morality. Glenn tries to pivot by saying that an impersonal form of the good feels unfitting to him. But notice what he did there. He shifted from logical argument to personal preference. He said it feels unfitting. That is not a rebuttal. That is an aesthetic complaint.
Because morality is, you need to be a moral agent, you need to be a person, really, in order for kind of moral statements to be true or false of you. And so I wonder whether there's something unsatisfying to me as a Christian in thinking about this Platonic realm as just the good, as itself impersonal, and therefore the good is itself neither good nor bad. And this, I feel, let me tell you history the way I want to tell history, and you can sort of fact check and correct me later, but it does seem to me like a lot of Jews in the time before the incarnation, and then certainly Christians from the time after the incarnation, were saying to a lot of Platonists, oh, you know, the good, we've got a name for him. Like he's called God. And that was kind of the way they did evangelism, and it was wildly successful, really. A lot of Platonists kind of became Christians because kind of the message to them was, you've believed in this impersonal thing called the good that grounds all things. Let me fill out that picture for you. And I think the way in which Christians can fill out that picture a lot more satisfyingly is in a Trinitarian doctrine of God, where you've got distinct persons who are equal but distinct, who love one another, and there is reciprocity in the life of God, such that 1 John 4 verse 8 can say God is love. It doesn't just say God is loving. See, that would be an attribute by which we could judge God. But 1 John 4 verse 8 doesn't say God is loving. He is loving. But it says God is love, constitutionally, eternally, primordially. The Father has been loving the Son in the joy of the Spirit. And because there's been this life of distinction and unity and mutual deference.
Now we get to the part where Glenn tries to recover. And honestly, I think this is where his argument gets even weaker, not stronger. He makes this claim that you need to be a moral agent. You need to be a person for moral statements to apply to you. And on the surface, that sounds reasonable. But think about what he is actually trying to do here. He is trying to say that Plato's impersonal form of the good cannot ground morality because it is not conscious. It is not personal. But here is the problem with that logic. Nobody said the foundation of morality needs to be a person. Mathematical truths are not persons. The laws of logic are not persons, yet they are objective and they apply to everyone. Why would moral truths be any different? And then we get to what I think is the most revealing moment in this entire section. Glenn says that Christians basically told the Platonists, hey, you believe in this thing called the good? We have a name for it. It is called God. And he says this evangelism was wildly successful. Do you see what just happened there? Glenn is essentially admitting that the Christian concept of God was marketed to Greek philosophers by rebranding their existing beliefs. That is not evidence that Christianity discovered some deep truth. That is evidence of effective religious salesmanship. Think about this historically. When Christianity spread through the Roman Empire, it did not succeed purely on theological merit. It absorbed and adapted existing philosophical frameworks. It took Platonic concepts and gave them Christian names. Glenn is presenting this as a win, but from a critical perspective, it shows that the concept of the good existed before Christianity claimed ownership of it. So when Glenn celebrates how many Platonists converted, I hear something very different. I hear confirmation that you do not need the Christian God to arrive at concepts of goodness and moral truth. The Greeks were already there. Christianity just showed up and said, that thing you already believe in, it is actually our God.
They kind of, according to scripture and according to the Christian tradition, there is a life of liberty, equality, and fraternity from before the world began. There is a moral life that predated and produced the world. Not just an impersonal kind of form of the good, but actual interpersonal love. So I would say the good life is love, because as 1 John 4 goes on to say, God is love. Those who live in love live in God, and God lives in them. So I would say love is the greatest commandment. It's the greatest commandment from Jesus because it is this ultimate ontological truth about ultimate reality, that God is love. Therefore, to go with love is to go with the grain of the universe.
Any final questions? I know you want to say. So first, I just wanted to tell you a couple more questions.
Right. My question is for Glenn. So how can we be sure that the Christian set of morals, especially in the Old Testament, is consistent with the set of morals that we innately feel as humans?
Well, it's not, because I think Scripture is a story, and it's a story with a beginning and a middle and an end, and development and a fall, and lots of twists and turns along the way, and that's not really. I hope it doesn't come across as that's the post hoc rationalization for, oh, I don't like the Old Testament. I do like the Old Testament. I love the Old Testament. I read the Old Testament every day. But Jesus himself told us to read the Bible in a certain way. So in Matthew chapter 19, he's asked a particularly thorny ethical dilemma from his own day. And he actually gives a framework to tell the story of Scripture. He said, well, in the beginning, it was like this. But then there was a fall and our hearts were hardened. So Moses told the people this, and this was a non-ideal state of affairs. And there are many things in the Old Testament that are profoundly non-ideal, right? And then Jesus says, and I have come to restore things to the intention at the beginning. So there's lots we could go into there, but I think it's very important to read Scripture as a story with a shake to it. In the beginning, goodness, a fall into something that's very suboptimal. And even Jesus says, look, Moses gave you even laws that were suboptimal. How much more suboptimal was the behavior of the people to whom those laws were given? And even within the Old Testament, there's lots of questioning of the activity of the people and all that kind of thing. So that's the way a Christian reads Scripture, through the lens of Jesus, as we see the shape of the story.
I think this is a really key question, because obviously you're articulating that Christianity is the best, goodest, bestest thing, twittering love in the world, but then you might want to respond to how does a secular person hear what he's just said?
In terms of the kind of reading Scripture as a story?
Is Christianity the good for human rights, equality? Is it what we want?
And here it is. This is the moment that made this entire debate worth watching, because a student asks the question that so many people are afraid to ask. How can we trust that Christian morals, especially in the Old Testament, are consistent with what we consider moral today? And Glenn's answer? He says, well, it is not consistent. Let that sink in for a moment. A Christian apologist, someone whose entire job is to defend the faith, just admitted on camera that the Old Testament contains things that are, in his own words, profoundly non-ideal. He even goes further and says that Moses gave laws that were suboptimal. This is huge, because the standard argument from religious apologists is that morality comes from God, and God is perfect, therefore biblical morality is perfect. But Glenn just blew a hole in that entire framework. If the Old Testament contains suboptimal laws that even Jesus apparently disagreed with, then what does that tell you about divine command theory? It tells you that morality evolved. It tells you that even within the biblical tradition itself, there is an acknowledgement that earlier moral codes were flawed and needed updating. And if morality can evolve and improve over time, then it is not fixed, eternal, and handed down from a perfect being. It is a human project. It is something we develop and refine. And here's what fascinates me about how Glenn tries to frame this. He talks about Scripture as a story with a beginning, middle, and end. He says there was an ideal state, then a fall, and then restoration through Jesus. But that narrative framing does not solve the problem. It highlights it. If God allowed suboptimal laws to exist for centuries, laws that caused real harm to real people, then either God is not all-powerful, not all-knowing, or not all good. You cannot escape that trilemma. The existence of morally problematic content in Scripture is not a feature of some grand narrative. It is a bug that apologists have to explain away. What I want you to take from this is simple. When even the defenders of religious morality admit that their own holy texts contain things that are profoundly non-ideal, you have to ask yourself, why would we base our modern ethics on that foundation? Why not acknowledge that human beings are capable of moral reasoning without needing ancient texts that even believers admit are flawed? The student who asked that question did something powerful. They held Glenn accountable to his own standards, and his answer revealed more than any atheist argument ever could. The case for secular morality does not need to tear down religion. Sometimes the defenders of religion make the case for us. So what do you guys think of this? Leave your thoughts down in the comments. Please like and subscribe, and I will see you in the next video.